All right, so are you ready to get into it? Because today we are diving deep into the idea of good and evil.
Wow. Yeah.
You sent us this video from the channel Bridges.
Yeah.
That really, breaks down morality in a way that I think is making us rethink some pretty basic assumptions.
Yeah. I think what really struck me at the beginning is how this video opens with such a huge historical example like slavery.
Okay.
I mean, it's something we all agree is horrifying today, but it was widely accepted, even seen as morally, right? Just a few generations ago.
Yeah, it's kind of wild to think about. The video points out that people used, religion, the law, even economic arguments to justify owning other human beings. It's like, wow, are we really as morally enlightened as we like to think we are?
Exactly. And I think if something that seems so obviously wrong to us now was considered normal such a short time ago,
right?
What does that say about our own moral beliefs?
Yeah.
It's a real wake-up call. It makes you wonder if maybe what we think of as good and evil is not as fixed as we assume.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right, so then the video dives into some pretty intense philosophy.
Yeah.
Starting with this guy, Friedrich Nietzsche, who, as I understand it, was not afraid to shake things up a little bit.
Oh, yeah. He was a total rebel when it came to morality. Okay. I mean, Nietzsche just straight up rejected the idea of universal objective right and wrong. Yep. Instead, he saw morality as something that kind of emerges from these power struggles.
Oh, interesting.
Throughout history.
Okay, so he even uses this term slave morality, which sounds a little intense.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
So Nietzsche was basically saying that values like humility, obedience, self-sacrifice, things often associated with Christianity, were actually tools used by the powerless to control the powerful.
Interesting.
So imagine you're a slave. You can't physically overpower your master.
Right.
But you can make him feel guilty, maybe question his own power by promoting values that make him look bad.
I see. So it's like a subtle form of resistance.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, but what about the powerful then?
Yep.
What did Nietzsche say about their morality?
So he called it master morality.
Yep.
It's all about strength, pride, ambition.
Okay.
The values of those who don't need to justify their actions to anyone.
Nice.
So, think of a conquering warrior, a bold leader.
Right.
Nietzsche saw this as the original morality before it was flipped on its head by the powerless.
Okay, so what you're saying is what we call good and evil isn't some, divine truth handed down from on high.
Right.
It's more like a battlefield where different values are constantly clashing.
Totally. And that's what's so unsettling and fascinating about Nietzsche.
Right.
He forces you to ask yourself, are the values you hold dear really yours?
Yeah.
Or are they just these leftovers from historical power struggles, stuff you've inherited without even realizing it?
That's a profound thought. Okay, wait, there's more. The video doesn't stop there.
It keeps going.
It goes on to talk about another thinker
who
takes these ideas even further.
Yeah.
Michel Foucault.
Right. Foucault kind of picks up where Nietzsche leaves off.
Okay.
But instead of focusing on just these big clashes between powerful and powerless, he zooms in on how specific institutions shape our ideas of what's normal, what's healthy, and ultimately what's moral.
Interesting.
So think governments, legal systems, even things like medicine and education, they all play a role.
The video uses this example of how we understand madness.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really fascinating because, our views on mental illness have changed so much over time.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what was once seen as demonic possession or even, a sign of some divine inspiration later gets labeled as mental illness.
Right.
But it's not like some scientific breakthrough happened.
Right.
It's about who had the power to define what was normal and what was deviant.
Right.
And guess what? It was usually the people in power.
Oh, yeah, I see what you're getting at. So, the label of madness could be used to control people, to silence dissenting voices, or even just to justify locking someone away because they were inconvenient.
Exactly. And, Foucault had this idea of discourse.
Right.
Which basically means that power isn't just about brute force, It's about controlling the narrative.
Right.
It's about shaping the way we talk about things, the categories we use to understand the world.
I see.
And morality is a huge part of that.
So it's not just about laws and punishments. It's about the very language we use, the way we frame things.
Totally.
And that's how we decide what's good and what's evil.
And those stories, those narratives are constantly being rewritten.
Right.
Think about something like social media algorithms,
Right.
They're deciding what you see, what you don't see, what gets amplified.
Right.
They're shaping your reality. Mm-hmm. And in a way, they're shaping your understanding of what's acceptable, what's normal, what's morally right. That's Foucauldian power in action.
Whoa, that's kind of scary, but also really relevant. Okay, so we've got Nietzsche questioning the very foundations of morality, Foucault showing us how institutions subtly control our thinking. And then the video brings up a truly horrifying example about the Holocaust.
Right, and this is where things get really, really heavy.
Yeah.
Because the Holocaust shows us what can happen when moral judgments get warped and twisted to serve the interests of, those in power.
It's chilling to think about how, something as horrific as the systematic extermination of millions of people could be justified, within a particular moral framework.
And that's exactly the point.
Yeah.
What we condemn as evil today was seen as morally righteous by many people at the time.
Right.
It should make us question any claim to absolute moral certainty.
So if we accept even for a moment that morality isn't fixed, that it can be distorted and manipulated, that raises a really scary question. How do we prevent another Holocaust?
Right.
How do we stop people from twisting morality to justify terrible acts?
That's a huge question.
Yeah.
And it's one we'll need to grapple with, but first there's another layer to this whole discussion.
Yeah. We need to unpack, because the video doesn't just present Nietzsche and Foucault's perspective.
Right.
It also acknowledges that there are philosophers who believe in objective moral truths, like Immanuel Kant.
Oh, okay. So now we're getting into like a philosophical tug of war.
A little bit.
Right. Absolute morality versus relative morality. So which side wins?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
But before we try to answer that, let's take a closer look at Kant's perspective, because he offers a very different way of thinking about good and evil.
Okay, let's do it.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we went down this whole rabbit hole with Nietzsche and Foucault,
right,
we were talking about good and evil as if they were these, like fixed, universal things. But now I'm not so sure.
Right.
If morality really is fluid, if it can be shaped and twisted.
Yeah.
That kind of changes everything, doesn't it?
It definitely challenges some fundamental assumptions.
Yeah.
But, it doesn't mean we have to just throw out the whole idea of morality altogether.
Okay. I think instead we can start to see it as a process, something we're all actively engaged in.
Okay. But how do we even begin to, make sense of that?
Right.
I mean, there's no ultimate rule book. How do we know what's right and what's wrong? It's almost like the ground is shifting beneath my feet here.
I get it. I mean, it can be really disorienting.
Yeah.
But think about it this way. If morality isn't some static set of rules, it means we have the power to shape our own value.
Okay.
To participate in defining what it means to be good. That's actually pretty empowering.
Okay. I see where you're going with that. It's like, instead of blindly following rules that someone else came up with.
Yeah.
Right. We have a responsibility to think critically about what we believe in and why.
Exactly. And that critical thinking is so essential.
Right.
Remember all those kind of horrific examples we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
Like slavery, the Holocaust. They show us how dangerous it can be when people cling to these rigid moral systems and claim to have all the answers.
So instead of clinging to those systems, you're saying we need to be open to new perspectives, to questioning our own assumptions.
Yeah.
Maybe even being willing to admit that we could be wrong.
Absolutely. And, that doesn't mean that everything is relative.
Right.
Or that, there are no values worth fighting for.
Right.
It's about being more thoughtful, more nuanced in our approach to ethic, recognizing, the power dynamics at play, the historical and cultural forces that shape our belief.
Yeah.
It's a much more complex, but ultimately more honest way of approaching morality.
Okay, that makes sense. But I keep coming back to this idea of moral relativism.
Right.
The video uses that term a lot, and honestly, it kind of freaks me out.
Yeah.
Does that mean that anything goes? That there's no such thing as right and wrong?
I think that's a common misconception.
Okay.
Moral relativism doesn't mean that all moral judgments are valid.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that our understanding of morality is always evolving. It's shaped by our experiences, our cultures, our values.
So it's more about acknowledging the complexity of things.
Yeah.
Recognizing that there might not be a single right answer for everyone in every situation.
Right. It's about being humble enough to admit that we don't have all the answers, that there's always more to learn, and that our own moral compass might need some adjusting along the way.
Okay, so how do we actually put all of this into practice?
Right.
How do we live in a world without absolute moral truth? The video talked about critical thinking, but what does that actually look like in our daily life?
Well, for starters, I think we need to be aware of the power dynamics behind moral systems. Who benefits from a particular set of beliefs, whose interests are being served. These are questions we should be asking ourselves all the time,
Yeah.
Whether it's about social norms, political ideologies, or even our own personal values.
So it's not just about questioning authority figures or institutions.
Right.
It's about being willing to question our own assumptions, our own biases.
Exactly. Self-reflection is crucial. Why do we believe what we believe? what blind spots might we have? It's like holding up a mirror to our own morality.
Right.
And being brave enough to ask tough questions.
So let's say I'm facing a tough decision at work, something that could affect my colleagues, my clients, even my own career.
Yeah.
How do I navigate that kind of situation when I'm not operating from a place of absolute moral certainty? It's easy to say be ethical, but what does that actually look like in the real world?
That's a great question, and it's one we all grapple with in different ways. I think the key is to approach those situations with humility and be willing to listen to different perspectives, to consider the potential consequences of your actions, and to recognize that there may not be one single right answer.
So it's more about being thoughtful, deliberate, and recognizing that there might be trade-offs involved.
Right, and being comfortable with ambiguity.
Okay.
Sometimes the best we can do is make the most informed, compassionate decision possible, even if we can't be absolutely certain that it's the right one.
I have to admit, this whole conversation has been really eye-opening, but also a little overwhelming.
Yeah.
If we can't rely on absolute moral truth, how do we avoid becoming morally paralyzed? How do we stop ourselves from throwing our hands up and saying, well, everything is relative, so why even bother trying to be good?
That's a valid concern, but I think the key is remembering that moral relativism isn't about giving up on morality altogether.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing the complexity of ethical decision-making and the need for ongoing critical reflection.
So it's not about saying anything goes.
Right.
It's about being more intentional, more mindful of the choices we make and the values we hold.
Exactly, and recognizing that those values can evolve as we learn and grow. The challenge isn't to find the one right answer. It's to engage in a process of ongoing ethical inquiry.
Okay.
To constantly question our assumptions and strive to make choices that align with our deepest values, even if those values are always evolving.
This has been incredibly stimulating, but before we move on, you said earlier that uncertainty can be liberating.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that a bit? Because honestly, right now, uncertainty feels a lot more unsettling than freeing.
Well, think about it this way. Acknowledging the fluidity of morality frees us from the tyranny of dogma.
Okay.
We're no longer bound by these rigid systems of belief that may be outdated, oppressive, or simply not applicable to our own lives.
So we have more freedom to create our own moral compass, to define what's right and wrong based on our own experiences and understanding of the world.
Exactly. And that's both a tremendous responsibility and an incredible opportunity.
Yeah.
It means we have the power to make a difference, to create a more just compassionate and ethical world. But it also means we can't afford to be complacent.
Right.
We need to be constantly questioning, learning, and evolving.
It's a powerful thought. But if we're always questioning, always evolving, how can we ever be sure we're on the right track?
That's where the video brings in Immanuel Kant and his idea of the categorical imperative. Remember him from earlier?
Yeah.
He offers a different perspective on morality, one that might provide some grounding in all this uncertainty.
Okay, so we've gone from, thinking about good and evil as these absolute unshakable truths to seeing them as something much more complex.
Yeah.
So something that's shaped by power, history, and even our own perceptions.
Yeah. It's a lot to process.
Honestly, it's a lot to wrap my head around.
Yeah, it is a big shift in perspective.
Right.
But remember, the video we're talking about doesn't leave us just hanging out there.
Right.
It offers some guidance for how to navigate this more complex moral landscape.
Right. You mentioned Immanuel Kant earlier.
Yeah.
And his idea of the categorical imperative. I have to admit, I'm a little fuzzy on what that actually means.
Right. So it's essentially a principle that helps us determine if an action is morally right.
Okay.
Kant argued that we should act only according to rules that we could universalize, meaning rules that we would be okay with everyone following all the time.
So it's like asking yourself, what if everyone did this?
Okay.
If the answer is chaos and suffering, then probably not a good moral rule.
Right. For Kant, this was a way of establishing a kind of bedrock morality, something that transcended individual preferences or cultural norm.
Okay, so that's interesting, but how does Kant's idea fit in with everything else we've been talking about? Nietzsche and Foucault seem to be saying that morality is totally relative,
Right.
that it's all about power and perspective.
Right. And that's the tension we're kind of exploring here.
Yeah.
On the one hand, we have this idea that morality is fluid, shaped by history and context. On the other hand, we have this desire for some kind of anchor, some principle that helps us distinguish right from wrong.
So are we just stuck in this philosophical tug of war forever? Is there any way to reconcile these seemingly opposing views?
I think the key is to find a balance. We can acknowledge the insights of Nietzsche and Foucault that power morality, that our understanding of good and evil evolve time, but we don't have to throw the baby out with the bath.
Meaning, we can still strive to be ethical, even if we recognize that there's no one-size-fits-all answer to every moral dilemma.
Exactly. We can use Kant's categorical imperative or other ethical frameworks as guides, while also remaining open to different perspectives and, recognizing the limits of our own understanding.
Okay, so if we're not looking for absolute truth and we're not just letting anything go, what are we striving for? What does it actually mean to live an ethical life in this kind of world?
I think it comes down to a few key things: critical thinking, empathy, and a willingness to engage in ongoing dialogue and reflection.
Can you break that down for me?
Sure. So critical thinking means constantly questioning our own assumptions and biases, as well as the moral systems we inherit.
Okay.
Empathy means trying to understand the perspectives of others, even those who hold different values than our own.
Right.
And ongoing dialogue, means being open to challenging our own beliefs and having honest conversations about difficult ethical issues.
It sounds like it's a lot more about the process, than arriving at some fixed destination.
Exactly. It's about being actively engaged in the messy, challenging, and ultimately rewarding work of figuring out how to be good in a world that doesn't always offer easy answers.
So that brings us back to the initial question we posed at the beginning of this deep dive.
Right.
Is there such a thing as absolute good and evil?
After exploring all these ideas, I think it's safe to say that the answer is far more nuanced than we might have initially thought. Good and evil aren't fixed points on some moral map.
Right.
They're fluid concepts shaped by history, power dynamic, and our own evolving understanding of the world.
So where does that leave us?
Yeah.
What are we supposed to do with this newfound understanding of, as the video calls it, the illusion of good and evil?
It's not about giving up on morality altogether. Instead, it's a call to action.
Okay.
It's an invitation to become more conscious, more deliberate in how we approach ethical dilemmas.
So instead of searching for some elusive absolute truth,
right,
we should focus on cultivating a more nuanced, compassionate, and critically engaged approach to ethics.
Exactly. And that's a lifelong journey.
Yeah.
It requires constant reflection, questioning, and a willingness to embrace uncertainty.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about, and I have a feeling I'll be revisiting these ideas for a long time to come.
I suspect you will, and hopefully this conversation has sparked a similar process of reflection for you, our listener, because ultimately the most important takeaway from all of this is that morality isn't something that's handed down to us.
Right.
It's something we actively create through our choices and actions.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive, but the conversation doesn't end here.
Yeah.
We encourage you to continue exploring these ideas, to challenge your own assumptions, and to actively participate in the ongoing project of defining what it means to be good in a world where the boundaries of good and evil are constantly shifting. Thanks for joining us.